Say more about what was it that made her Robert, I want to start by asking a little, just a light little question about Reconstruction. And I was thinking particularly in watching Inlets tonight about bringing back a work that is one of the nature studies. And in teaching this work to the dancers, are you teaching the system that Merce used? Are you using images of water? How are you bringing this work to them?
Well, like Merce, I start with the steps and transmit them, and then these steps have, Inlets has a certain quality because it's very quiet. So I try that to impress that idea on the dancers, and I can still show them. I can still show them. So, but it's a process, and so I have to give them time.
As Robert says, it always starts with steps, for sure. So we learn phrases. I think, if I remember well, it's like 64 phrases in Inlets that are Inlets. There's Inlets 1 and then Inlets 2. So he uses the same those phrases we learn first, and then we try to make those phrases ours, meaning that we have to, manage to do them technically, but also like trying to inhabit them as we can. And I think Robert also talked a lot about how Merce was fond of nature and as a big observer of nature and all of its qualities, so water, the wood, like all these elements. So I don't try to copy that, of course, but it's there in the spirit of the dancers, I think, to listen also to these drops of water and all that. So and sometimes when I look at nature, I think of that. I think of Merce, and I think how he looked at it and how he tried to also embody it in his dance. That's what I try to do.
It seems perfect to have here in the Berkshires as we, enjoy nature. I want to ask about How to Pass, Robert, because you're called the recoverer of this work when it was restaged in 2002, and so that one was one that hadn't been done, and then you brought it back, and you persuaded Merce to perform the text. Could you talk a little bit about bringing it back again for 2019?
Well, with most of the reconstructions that I made while I was assistant to the choreographer for the Cunningham Company, was that I would start in a workshop setting with the students, and during a time when the company was off, and Merce would be there because he was always working on a new piece. And so I worked with the students. We only had one recording of this performance, and it was severely edited, with most of the time spent looking at John and David Vaughn. So you had big holes. So I worked with the students, and I asked Merce, well, what do you think? Can we do it? And one of the talking points was that we wanted to have Merce on stage, so that Merce would do the readings with David Vaughn. And that's how it started, and that's how most of the reconstructions started. They started in a workshop form, because we always work through process. It takes time to do these things, and in France we really don't have the time, all the time to do that. Usually in the creation we do, but afterwards when we reprise something, there's not as much time. But over a period of 2 years now, because we started performing Inlets 2, in 2017, because we went to the Joyce with it. So once you perform something, it's like a notch, you gain some experience each time you're on stage.
So, Laura, I introduced you as a musician, which you certainly are, but you're also the director of the John Cage Trust. And so I've been thinking about the kind of thrilling position to be a scholar, a holder of the institution, but also now a performer, and not only now, but a performer of this work. And if you could just say something about getting to be in the work and how it changes from, sitting at a desk and responding to requests for music or something like that.
I like to think that it allows me to sort of express something that I actually experienced with John Cage, who I worked with before he died and before we formed the John Cage Trust. So it and I was a performer when I met John Cage. So It just allows me to express a kind of relationship with him. John Cage wrote 3 or 4 pieces that he referred to as works of contingency. And these are works wherein he was working out his own animosity about improvisation. So he didn't like improvisation, and everybody knew that. And it was mostly because he didn't like that people repeated themselves, or that they did only what they knew how to do, which he, in a limited way, thought of as jazz. But in point of fact, he spent a great deal of time thinking about how he might compose pieces in a way that would be unknown as to what you were going to do in real time, but that you actually couldn't control, and you literally couldn't repeat yourself. I say that piece is devilishly difficult to do because the shells have absolute minds of their own. All you have to do as a performer is to manipulate the shells, and they gurgle, or they don't. So you can tip it, and it gurgles beautifully, and you go, oh, I'm going to do that again, and you tip it, and it does nothing. And we all have these bugaboo shells up there that do nothing. We can't get them to do anything. Someone else takes it on, we swap shells, and that person goes, gurgle, 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 gurgle. You take it back, and you can't get it to do anything. These are all Cage's shells, most of which are conchs, but not all. Conchs, I just found out from my partner tonight, who is my Google source. Conchs are shells medium to large size that have holes on both ends, whereas we have tiny round ones that we also use.
I want to ask about first for the two of you who have danced to the spoken text, and if you have a different relationship, because the words make sense in a way that we see connections to the dancing between the stories in a way that's very different from the music, and if you feel those, and if it enlivens your dancing in a different kind of way from other kinds of sound scores. Robert, maybe you could start.
Well, the problem is that when we work in silence, so that actually when you're dancing, you don't really hear. You're too busy, too occupied. When you're off stage, you hear. But for some reason, your senses are, you're full. You're busy, you're busy dancing. So the music, you don't really hear the words, do you?
No, we don't hear the words, and yeah, we work in silence all the time, and it's always different stories, always silence at unexpected moments, which is always like super, like these chance procedures. Sometimes there's one word, that's gonna come, and you're like, oh, I recognize that word, it makes sense, but then you're too busy to hold your balance or jump or like try to connect with other. So it's lots of things at the same time. And really backstage, sometimes I try to listen to them, and also the laughter of the audience, which is different than in France. Also, we did this piece in France with a French translation, and it makes the whole thing very different as well. I think it's important in this work, because we work in silence, to understand their inner musicality of the movement itself and not based on an outside music. So the body becomes, musical in a way with an internal rhythm. Sometimes there are phrases that are in counts, not particularly in those pieces, but there is this, we know that this has to be, fast, and then all of a sudden it changes to a more like slow mode, and it's very typical from Merce's work to change speed, very quickly.
Change the speed of the movement.
Yeah, the speed of the movement. So this belongs to the sense of rhythm in itself.
The stories all come from John Cage's piece. It's called Indeterminacy, New Aspects of Form in Instrumental and Electronic Music. But the piece that we know of as Indeterminacy has 90 stories in its published performance edition, and John Cage and David Tudor performed those on a Folkways album, those 90 stories. But there were other stories, and I bring this up for a particular reason. Tonight, Adam and I were working with 106 stories, because we wanted to include the stories that are not in the performance edition that are particularly about Cunningham and his mother. So those stories are not in the performance edition. But I can tell you that when Merce performed it, when Robert brought it back, Merce came to me and said, oh, couldn't you find those stories about my mother? And so we threw those into the mix. So every night, Adam and I do chance operations, just like Cage did, on the 106 stories, we ask the question, which of these stories do each of us read? And the second question is, when do we read these stories? So the stories are subtly different, remarkably not entirely different from night to night. There were repeated stories. Adam and I are always enchanted at what happens when we do the chance operations.
I'm wondering, Robert, if you would say your favorite piece to watch on tonight's program versus your favorite piece to do.
Oh, my favorite piece to watch?
Yeah.
And
And then I'm going to add, which was your
Sweet
favorite?
for Five.
Sweet for
sure,
Five.
Yeah.
How come?
Well, it's a classic. It's perfect. What can I say? Merce Cunningham, of course, was a soloist. Now we know him as a choreographer, or you see him on the film as an old man. But the fact is, he was a dancer first. And every piece he made, he challenged himself in a new way. So you go through the chronology of the work, and each piece he gave himself new challenges, physical challenges. And for the many other dancers have done those parts as well, and it's a thrill, a real thrill.